Thank you for joining the RIETI VBL webinar. I'm Fukuoka Noriyoshi, Consulting Fellow, RIETI and Principal Deputy Director, Trade Policy Bureau, METI. And I will be serving as the moderator. Today, we are truly honored to welcome Miss Daleep Singh, former Deputy National Security Advisor and Deputy Director of National Economic Council. The title of today's presentation is the Economic Security Statecraft. We will listen to his presentation for about 20 minutes or so, and then ask Mr. Hirohide, Consulting Fellow, RIETI and Special Advisor, former Vice Minister for International Affairs, METI, to give some comments and discussion with Mr. Singh for 20 minutes. Mr. Singh, please start your presentation or speech.
Okay, thank you, Hirai-san, and thank you, Fukuoka-san, for inviting me here. I will make 5 observations and 3 recommendations in order to provoke conversation, and then we'll take it from there. So the first observation I want to make is that we are now living in the most intense period of great power competition, at least since the end of the Cold War, perhaps since the end of World War II. Both Russia and China have expressed and revealed a desire to challenge the G7-led international order. Both Russia and China have the capacity to do so in different ways. China, because it's nearly a peer competitor to the U.S. along economic, military, and technological dimensions. Russia doesn't punch at the same strategic weight as China, but it's willing to take more risk. Its leadership feels more deeply aggrieved, and it still has systemic relevance in nuclear weapons and fossil fuel energy in particular. And both Russia and China are actively trying to carve out a sphere of influence in their respective backyards. And they're willing to take tactical risks in order to do so, motivated, I would say, by a shared feeling, I think incorrectly, that the West in general, and the G7 in general, and the US in particular, is in structural decline due to political dysfunction, due to social cleavages, due to fiscal profligacy. And so this is the contest that's playing out. That's observation 1. Observation 2 is that because great powers are also nuclear powers, there is still a mutual deterrent against kinetic conflict. And let's hope that deterrent remains strong. But even if that's correct, the path of least resistance for conflict will be in the economic and technological realms. And so 3, this is where sanctions come in. Observation 3 is that sanctions and really economic statecraft more generally, so think of all the related tools to sanctions, export controls, tariffs, price caps, investment restrictions, and so forth. They're going to be used with greater frequency and greater potency than ever before. So observation 4 is on the most recent example of deploying these sanctions and statecraft more generally. That's Russia. And I would say that sanctions, the G7 sanctions against Russia, for which my colleagues in the American government are truly grateful for Japan's solidarity and cooperation throughout the entire episode. These sanctions are doing their job in a strategic sense. And I think the best way to evaluate them is against the strategic objectives that were laid out at the beginning of deploying these measures. In the short term, maximize the costs on President Putin for the continuation of the war, subject to an acceptable amount of spillovers to the global economy. 2, over the medium term, degrade Putin's capacity to exert influence and project power on the world stage. And 3, over the long term, establish a negative demonstration effect for any autocrat that wishes to redraw borders by force. I think sanctions are accomplishing those objectives, no more and no less. They were never intended as a standalone measure to win the war. They were always meant as a force multiplier to complement the efforts of the Ukrainian military on the battlefield, and also in diplomacy by creating leverage for the eventual negotiations, which is the only way this war is going to end, is diplomatically. The fifth observation is that I'm enormously proud of the unity that has been forged within the G7 in particular, but also beyond the G7, to respond within hours of the invasion with unprecedented economic force, using tools like never before. But I'm also quite aware that 2/3 of the world's population lives in countries that have not joined the sanctions coalition. And in my conversations with government officials from those countries, I hear two types of concerns. One is on the grounds of efficacy. They question whether the impact of sanctions on Putin's behavior is enough to justify the economic costs and risks that they involve. And second is they sometimes question the legitimacy of sanctions. And they wonder whether they are an illegitimate exercise of brute economic force, mostly American brute economic force. And I think these concerns deserve our utmost attention. First, on the merits. Second, because we know the size of the sanctions coalition matters greatly to the force of sanctions. And third, because this skepticism, if left unaddressed, will erode our credibility, will hurt our soft power, and will degrade our capacity to attract and induce countries into our geopolitical orbit. So what do we do about it? And here let me make three observations, and I'll close with these recommendations. Number one is I think it's time to articulate at the highest levels of government within the G7 a doctrine of economic statecraft. We've spent hundreds of years crafting and refining military doctrine, but the effort to lay down a doctrine of economic statecraft has really just begun. I think doing so would serve two purposes. One, if taken seriously, it would prevent and constrain overreach in the use of these tools. And second, if we take doctrine seriously, it would give comfort to the rest of the world that we're not firing these economic weapons in a way that's arbitrary or capricious. So what would a doctrine look like? I think number one, it would lay down guiding principles. And I have a few of these principles in mind, but these are mostly illustrative. They should really be debated and deliberated within government and across governments. I think they should be used sparingly and only when core international principles that underpin peace and security are at risk. In other words, they should not be used to create commercial advantage. Two, they should be responsible to avoid unnecessary spillovers to the civilian population of the target and to third countries. Three, I think they should be calibrated to maximize the chance of coordination among like-minded partners. Four, they should be flexible so that the impact can be ratcheted higher or lower depending on the impact delivered to the target and the target's response. Five, they need to be sustainable for the global economy because they're typically designed to work over the long term. Six, I think they do have to pass a threshold of efficacy. That is, the impact delivered to the target and the influence on the target's behavior has to be judged as sufficient to justify the economic costs and risks involved. And lastly, and I would say most importantly, their design and execution have to be infused with a sense of humility. Let's face it, sanctions and statecraft involves the dark arts of breaking the bonds in the global economy through trade and capital and technology. We're going to make mistakes in the process of doing so, at least in terms of second and third order effects. So humility is really all about our willingness to change our mind, to course correct, and to admit when we're wrong. In addition to guiding principles, I think we need to establish rules of engagement, first for ourselves and our closest allies, and then beyond, that really limit the use of these tools in terms of why we use them, when we use them, how, and against whom. So why means we need to be very clear about the geopolitical objective that sanctions and statecraft are designed to serve. When refers to the timing of when we deploy sanctions, either before, during, or after a trigger event. What is all about the limits of what we'll use sanctions for and what we won't contemplate. For example, I don't think we would contemplate sanctions that impede the flow of food or medicine. And we have to be very careful in how we deploy sanctions that violate private contracts or that seize private property without due process. How is really all about the circumstances in which we would be willing to act alone if we're unable or unwilling to build a coalition. And against whom is really delineating the difference between applying sanctions against private individuals and private companies as opposed to technocrats and government officials and military personnel and political leadership. I think the last element of doctrine that I have in mind is a code of conduct for practitioners of economic statecraft. I think just like military personnel, practitioners of economic statecraft should commit to an oath that upholds the standards of behavior that are outlined in the principles and the rules of engagement that I just described. We have to do that for our own credibility's sake. So that's all to do with doctrine, but I think the second recommendation I have, if we are going to take doctrine seriously, we have to upgrade the analytical infrastructure that executes sanctions and statecraft. So what do I have in mind for an upgrade of the analytical infrastructure? I can only speak about the US, but I suspect it applies more broadly. Number one, I think we need to take a regular inventory of the growing list of the tools of economic statecraft. And here I am influenced by my experience at the Fed. The Fed does a terrific job, in my opinion, of taking regular inventory of the tools it has at its disposal. For example, all of the unconventional policy tools beyond interest rate policy, like the discount window and special lending facilities and swap lines and asset purchases. If central banks can do this, then so should government authorities in the conduct of economic statecraft. Second, we should assess the efficacy of these tools when they're used alone or in tandem, when they're used unilaterally or multilaterally, when they're used before or after a trigger event. Three, we should analyze the historical spillovers and limitations of these tools and document lessons learned, both for ourselves within the government, but also for the broader public. There needs to be a sense of accountability. Four, we should simulate the use of these tools by stress testing and wargaming them in multi-stage, multiplayer conflict scenarios that play out over the course of years. And I think that effort should begin by assessing where do our collective strengths intersect with the target's vulnerabilities and vice versa. And that should evolve into a continuous process that helps us identify where do we need to strengthen or invent new tools, new defense mechanisms, new forms of coordination. I think the fifth element of analytical infrastructure is to deal with evasion. We need to have preparation in advance of deploying sanctions or statecraft that anticipates how and where evasion will occur. And we need to have the ability to respond in real time, either by tightening the screws on sanctions or by applying outsized penalties for those that we've caught in evasion to serve as a more credible deterrent against evasion. And the last element of analytical infrastructure is, again, the most important, but it's personnel. I'm, again, only speaking about the US, but I think we need to have a multidisciplinary army of technocrats with multidisciplinary expertise across macroeconomics, the microeconomics of critical supply chains, trade finance, financial forensics, diplomacy, international law, and domestic law. And the team needs to be large enough, I think, to have enough absorption capacity for multiple crises at once. It needs to have connective tissue with allies and partners. It needs to have connective tissue with the regulatory community. It needs to have connective tissue with the private sector and key stakeholders that multiply the impact of sanctions. And so we need to have this team in place so that we can coordinate and execute at pace in the crucible moment. The last recommendation I have is based on an observation that, doctrine is great, and so is analysis and analytical infrastructure. But I think what will matter most to the rest of the world is if we strike a more deliberate balance in the conduct of economic statecraft. And I think we need to strike that balance in such a way that conveys a standing preference for using economic tools when they can attract and induce countries into our geopolitical orbit through the prospect of mutual economic gain, rather than feeding a perception that our focus and our energy is on creating tools that break linkages in the global economy and impose economic pain. So tools such as debt relief and concessional lending and infrastructure finance, supply chain partnerships, technology alliances, these are all examples of tools that have the prospect of attracting countries and forging an enduring alignment of interests before a conflict unfolds. And I think that's especially important when it comes to discussing the intensifying tensions with China. There's no question that China represents a different kind of challenge than Russia. With Russia, we found multiple areas of asymmetric advantage that the West and the G7 commanded against Russia. In other words, areas in which we produced or supplied something that Russia needed and couldn't easily replace from anywhere else or produce at home. I think with China, the challenge is greater because they have far more formidable defensive buffers, and Beijing also has far more potential to go on the economic offensive, either by exploiting choke points in critical supply chains like clean energy or pharmaceuticals, or by taking advantage of its unrivaled scale in the production of manufactured goods. That's not to say we couldn't impose sanctions or coercive devices in a conflict scenario with China. And no country is too big to sanction. But my point is that there's no obvious knockout blow that coercive measures by themselves could deliver in a full-fledged economic confrontation with China without severe collateral damage. And I think so it's doubly important for us to find ways right now, before a conflict scenario unfolds, to use the positive tools of economic statecraft to attract a larger coalition beyond just the G7 if we end up in a conflict scenario. And I'll just close by saying, to me, the most glaring opportunity that the G7 could collectively explore is to deal with the festering debt crisis in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia. And really what that involves is stepping up collectively to offer debt relief and infrastructure finance and concessional lending where China is stepping back. So thank you, Hirai-san, and look forward to your comments, and then, of course, Fukuoka-san for the moderated questions.